Everyone, welcome to our webinar on quality assessments, LMAs and FVAs. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is a topic that's particularly important to our field because this really determines everything that happens for a child. So I want to say thank you to Michelle Horseman for doing this webinar for us. She has lots of great information. I will post links for you to take a survey to let us know what you thought of this webinar and also any other webinars you are interested in. I will send an email with the PowerPoint as well as the survey as well as the TVI portal, so you can check out. We have a couple other webinars and then we will take a break in the summer and start again in September. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Horseman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So Conchita and I actually presented on learning media assessments about 2 years ago. So when she asked me to do this, I went ahead and pulled basically the presentation we had done, but made some updates because in 2 years things change and you learn and gain information. So I'm going to go through this. For those who are participating by phone, I am not going to necessarily read every slide, but I will definitely be talking about every slide. I can also tell you that I make really lengthy presentations because there's a lot of information, so I'm hoping that we will get through all of it. I'm going to kind of keep myself on track, and we'll do questions at the end. So I will try to save about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for any questions that anyone has. So I currently am the Education and Vision Assessor or Specialist at the Maryland School for the Blind. And prior to that, I was in the classroom, in the preschool classroom at Maryland School for the Blind for 9 years. And I also spent 1 year in a local county as an itinerant teacher. So in my current role, I've been there for 6 years, learning lots and lots about assessments and what the law says, and it was very eye-opening to me. So hopefully this information will be helpful for you. So today my goal is for us to, for everyone to be able to understand what the law states regarding the need for assessment for a student who is blind or visually impaired, understand the basic components of the learning media assessment and a functional vision assessment, identify at least 2 tools that can be used as part of a learning media assessment, and understand how the learning media assessment influences decisions regarding literacy for students who are blind or visually impaired. Truthfully, when we think about teaching as teachers, as with students, there is a toolbox that we have and we use every day, regardless of the student. No 2 students are the same. Even though we might use a similar approach, we're always varying it. And our students are no different. They really need tools and options available to them. And I really find that that's where the learning media assessment can be very beneficial. So starting with kind of the boring stuff, if you will, but really necessary, is the legal stuff. So for anyone participating by phone, when you get the PowerPoint, there are slides that are labeled legal details, and there are hyperlinks to IDEA and I think the COMAR slides as well. I will tell you though that if IDEA does what they just recently did and changes their website, those hyperlinks will no longer work, but right now they do. So the first one basically is the educational definition of visual impairment. And the part of this that I want to highlight is that it says, even with correction, it adversely affects a child's educational performance. So it's important because I know in school I was taught the legal definition of blindness, which is different than the educational. So that even with correction adversely affects a child's educational performance is very significant. So please keep that in mind. So on the next slide, this is talking about consideration of special factors for a child who is blind or visually impaired. And in here in IDEA, it states that unless there is an assessment which states otherwise, Braille is always the default literacy medium. So I want you guys to realize that it says it's always the default literacy medium. It does not say that we need to consider Braille. If a student has a visual impairment, they should be receiving instruction in Braille unless there has been an assessment that says otherwise. I can't tell you how many students, and it might just be that it didn't come from the county, which is very possible, but there are times where we get students and they get through middle school and we're not even seeing a learning media assessment or any documentation in the IEP about one having been done, and they're not receiving Braille. So it's really, really important that no matter what, you are providing Braille instruction unless there is an assessment that says otherwise. The next slide is the Code of Maryland Regulations, or COMAR, and this slide just highlights and links back to the previous slide. So it's connecting where COMAR and IDEA are saying the same exact thing, that unless that Braille and the use of Braille is needs to be provided to the student. So looking at assessment, you know, we often hear the words evaluation and we often hear the words assessment. And there is a difference. And then for anyone who has the PowerPoint or is looking at this with me, in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a hyperlink. It looks like a little web thing. And anyone who gets this, the slide says evaluation and assessment. And there is a hyperlink that talks about evaluation versus assessment. But the point here is evaluation is determining whether or not a child has a disability. So this is not the actual assessment. An assessment is a process. When I was talking with Conchita about this, you know, I've seen this a number of times, but it really kind of hit home when I was talking to Conchita about this webinar. And what we need to understand is that a learning media assessment, a functional vision assessment, any kind of assessment is a process to collect data. It's not an actual thing or task or activity. An assessment is different and individualized for every student. So while components might be the same, how you get that information can be very, very different. And I will share with you some of the tools that I use that I do tend to use with just about every student. But keep in mind that there are so many things out there and different ways of gaining information, and it really is important to do what's specific to the student and what best meets that student's needs. So looking at IDEA, and this was one of the things that they really changed. So the bullet points listed for the components of a learning media assessment are embedded in a letter that is hyperlinked here. But when looking at a learning media assessment, according to IDEA, they are not crazy specific. Basically, you're looking at the child's reading and writing skills, their needs, and appropriate reading and writing media. What's also really critical is that you need to consider the future needs for instruction in Braille and the use of Braille. And for that, and you'll probably hear me say this a number of times, what's really important about that future needs piece is a student who maybe has 20/40 vision right now and is using 12-point font, or maybe just needs a little bit of support, may have a degenerative visual condition. So that's where that future needs comes into play. We don't know what's going to happen, but we need to be the front line to make sure that that student has every tool under their belt available to them. One of the big questions that I kind of have come across is when you're completing a learning media assessment, especially considering literacy, are all of the components for a learning media assessment, those skills, those needs, their current reading and writing media, and future needs, Are they the same for students with disabilities as well as those without multiple disabilities? And the answer to that is yes. No matter who the student is, no matter whether they have just visual impairment, whether they have a learning disability and a visual impairment, maybe they have orthopedic impairments, intellectual disability. I mean, we all know that our students are not one shape and size. All students need the same components. Literacy is really, really important for all students and leads to independence. So we really need to be promoting that level of literacy for all of our students. So in completing this, there are some pieces for a learning media report and a functional vision assessment for the reports, which also is part of the assessment process, because your assessment process goes into a report, that I consider to be essential and things that you really need to cover. So the first slide does list them all out, and then there are additional slides, so I'm not going to read the first slide that we're currently on. Ideally, while I'm saying that these are components for both types of assessments and therefore reports, ideally, you should be completing a learning media and a functional vision assessment together. The learning media is what is required to be completed, not necessarily the functional vision assessment here in Maryland. However, you gain a lot of information for the learning media assessment regarding vision, because a child's vision is going to impact some of your responses and your decision making. So completing those two things together is really a best practice. So the validity statement just lets the reader know that the test is actually measuring what it is claiming to measure. So are you getting the good information? The purpose of the assessment tells the reader why the assessment was conducted. While that seems really easy to those in the vision field, and we're like, well, duh, you're just making, deciding whether or not Braille instruction is appropriate. It's not as intuitive to the rest of the world. And sometimes I know I feel like I'm repeating myself, but when I speak with parents, it's nice to see them think, oh, okay, because they don't really understand what is a functional vision assessment versus what the eye doctor does. What is a learning media assessment? Why is that important? So it's really necessary to make sure we're highlighting that in the report and when we're sharing that report at team. At MSB, the teams know what the purpose is. Having been in the county, the teams don't know, and they need a lot of education, and that's where we can be a strong advocate. In the backgrounds area, I've listed out a number of things, and one of the pieces that I actually will tell you I learned from Conchita and is actually listed in COMAR is looking at language and the student's native language and their mode of communication. And in COMAR, the native language includes mode of communication normally used by an individual who is blind or with no written language. So please keep that in mind. That's a very critical piece. We're looking at visual functioning. So what ophthalmologist does the student see? When were they last seen? I have seen ophthalmology reports that are 6 years old, not current. I always look for at least 3 years. 3 years is even very uncomfortable to me, but working with the teams to make sure that we have current 2 years would probably be best. And again, knowing the student is and their visual condition and talking sometimes to the parents. Sometimes they've taken their student or their child and they just haven't gotten the reports to you. So working with the family is also really a good way to get that. And finding out what parents have learned from the ophthalmologist and whether or not there are any glasses or prescriptions there. So it could even just be that they're protective lenses, but that's also really, really important. I've seen a lot of students have prescription protective lenses prescribed and they are not used or they don't have them. So very important information. The other piece that's important, whether it's a learning media assessment or a functional vision assessment, is to review the student's records. This can look at, do they have an educational assessment? What does that say about their reading and writing skills? You can get a lot of information from there. Even though you should be doing a functional vision assessment along with this, if a previous one was done, it's a good information to include, to talk about. You can compare and contrast, or you can just reference it, especially if it's very current. Was there a learning media assessment already done? Sometimes vision changes, and therefore the learning media assessment changes. This year I was requested to complete a learning media assessment and a functional vision assessment for a student who I had completed them on last year. And last year I did not have an eye doctor report. I just had previous reports to go on. This year I had an eye doctor report and it listed a cataract. Well, previously I had not considered, based on the student's diagnoses, there was nothing to say that there could be a potential progressiveness to the diagnosis. And looking at that cataract and looking at the fact that it could progress, I recommended completing another learning media assessment, which just meant giving myself more work, but that's what the student really needed. Another section to consider in either assessment is your strategies. What did you do to get there? This is the part where it becomes a process. What tools, what process or methods did you use to get the information that you have? So really being thorough about, even if you're just talking about in reading fluency, an informal reading inventory that might have been administered by a reading specialist, or if you administered one, or whether or not you just administered a checklist, observations, things like that, anything that you use. And you don't have to list it necessarily in a specific section, but making sure that within your report you're identifying how you obtained the information. Another piece that I think tends to get overlooked, and I can tell you that I am guilty of it more often than I'd like to be, but I always find that when I have parent and when I do interviews, especially with parents or caregivers, I get so much information, and it also helps to confirm a lot of times what I have found through my testing. Parents also really enjoy giving you information about their child and knowing that you actually believe them as an expert on the student and their child, because they really are. They may not really have an understanding of what their child's needs are in terms of education, and that's where we become the expert, but the parent really is the expert on their child. And we really need to be talking to them to get as much information as possible. Same with the teachers and other service providers, doing interviews with them. You get another great bit of information. I am always coming in as an outsider, and I know when I was an itinerant, seeing the student pulled out was a much different situation than when I had the opportunity to observe them in the classroom. And even when I did the observation, I was maybe getting, if I was lucky, 3 hours worth of observation. That was on a good day given the schedules. So talking to the teachers, getting their information and asking specific questions. Sometimes teachers will be frustrated because they just don't know, but asking what are strengths or concerns. Literacy, numeracy, listening skills. That's a really, really critical piece to the learning media assessment as well. And for students, where it's appropriate, interviewing the student. Where do they feel their strengths and needs are, and do they have anything that they really want you to look into? I've actually been pleasantly surprised when I've had the opportunity to interview students to hear some of the information they give. Another personal story this year, I was assessing a student who is in high school, and I asked about if he has a preferred eye, and he told me that he's told that he is blind in one of his eyes, but he didn't really know because his glasses were designed to be so that he couldn't see out of the one side. And when I asked him to actually use his told good eye, He looked at his glasses, and his glasses were just clear protective lenses. So information and really talking with the student is really critical. They don't always know what we think they know. Another critical piece for both reports is the summary, where you're interpreting the data, you're wrapping up the information and highlighting the main points. And then recommendations. You want to be very, very thorough. I always think about, when I'm writing my recommendations, what if the student moves to California or whatever, and this is the only information that somebody has or a team has? Really kind of always thinking about their current needs, what are their future needs, thinking about the student's age, whether or not there are additional disabilities, and as I keep reiterating, their current and future literacy needs. So moving on specifically to a learning media assessment, the things that you want to look for in a learning media assessment are use of sensory channels, reading efficiency, formal or functional reading and writing skills, and literacy tools. So when looking at the use of sensory channels, you can do this through observation, indicating how that data was obtained, and documenting primary and secondary learning channels. What's really important here that I have found is sometimes just because a student's primary learning channel, I'll say visual because I find that a lot, doesn't always mean that that's really what's best for the child. So if I'm doing observations, which I'll tend to do 3 observations, and I try to pick a variety of settings, maybe physical education or recess, an academic setting, technology. One of my absolute favorites is O&M. There's just so much information and opportunities to use sensory channels. But a lot of times a student defaults to using what little vision they have, and that's not necessarily what's always most efficient for them. And that's where you have to be the expert to say that, yes, this student is using vision, but it's not necessarily what they are, what's really their primary or best way. It's not necessarily the most efficient, and we have to teach those skills then. One of the tools, and I have more resources linked at the end of this presentation, but one of the tools that I use for observations is the sensory channels or use of sensory channels form from Koenig and Holbrook, the blue book from LMA that we all know and love. And again, that 3 observations that I talked about, that's what's recommended from them. And then you can use additional observers. So sometimes I'll see something and I'll think, I wonder if that's how that student always does that. And I'll talk to the teacher and say, I saw so-and-so do this, and is that normal? And they'll tell me, yeah, that's how they always do it. So it's good information. And the idea is to obtain at least 15 behaviors from each observation. So, reading fluency. At the end of this in the resources, I do have some additional tools listed. So for reading fluency, you can get this information from an educational assessment, a informal reading inventory, a formal reading inventory. I also like to use a couple of checklists. 2 are from the Koenig and Holbrook book, their readiness for a functional or conventional literacy program. And a lot of times what I'll say is so-and-so demonstrates, 5 out of 18 or 2 out of 16 skills and I'll identify the checklist. And I find these really helpful. Sometimes parents have an expectation that or even teachers have an expectation that the student can do more or less than they are actually capable of. And having that data from a checklist is really helpful. And in my case, I'll often ask the classroom teachers to complete that because they know the student best and they see the student all day, every day. And another tool I also really like, especially for students with multiple disabilities, is All Children Can Read from the National Center on Deaf Blindness. And that actually gives you a kind of stage at which the student is, and then additional suggestions for ways to increase literacy. And again, that is linked at the end of the PowerPoint in the resources. So also in the learning media assessment, we want to look at the literacy tools. What tools are the student currently using to complete literacy tasks? And do the current tools meet current academic learning needs, future academic learning needs, and future vocational needs? So we're not just looking at academics, we're looking at vocational, we're looking at those functional things that children are going to have to do at a later time once they leave school. And again, here it reiterates what I've been saying since the beginning. We're looking at current and future needs. So always looking at current and future. I just looked at a student this year who I didn't have to complete a learning media assessment on, but it was an educational assessment, and the handwriting was just not functional for class. And the recommendation was just to consider whether or not handwriting meets the needs for the classroom. And just that simple statement, the teacher was able to look at that and say, you know what, these don't, and we really need to decide what is best for this student. So something just as simple as that can help alert a team to thinking, you know, maybe this isn't best, and let's work together to figure out what we can do for this student. So that's kind of the section on the learning media assessment. And I also have another resource at the end of this. I'm not sure if we'll get a chance to get to, but I also want to talk about functional vision assessment. For functional vision assessment, and actually my learning media assessment, I have been using resources from a website called earubric.com. It's essential assessments for students who are blind or visually impaired. And it's a rubric that was created and I learned about through the Perkins class, Essential Assessments, that is led by Karen Blankenship. And it's great because there are content rubrics for ages 3 through 5, 5 through 22, and then students who are deafblind or have multiple disabilities. So the information I'm going to share with you here actually comes from the rubric for 5 through 22. And the rubrics are not significantly different, but there are some slight differences. And I figured since 5 through 22 covers such a wide variety or a wide age span that was kind of the best one to go on. So again, here we start with student observation. So you can see with a learning media assessment and a functional vision assessment, we want to do observation. Observation gives us a lot of information. And a lot of times when I'm doing a learning media observation, I will take notes about things related to functional vision. And some things that are listed in the rubric to be accomplished or include lighting, the physical arrangement of the environment, visual clutter, visual behaviors of the student, learning styles of the student, which kind of goes back to the learning media assessment, access to media, and classroom behavior. So using just that list in and of itself, you can see how it really ties back to that learning media assessment. Visual behaviors, learning styles, and access to media. If you have a student that is visual, and I do understand that it is very difficult to get a student who is visual that needs to learn Braille to stop using their vision. So I'm not unrealistic here. I'm just preaching what's best practice. Is, you know, if you see a student who is putting their nose on the page, I was in a classroom the other day and the teacher said, if your nose is touching the screen of the tablet, that probably means you're too close. And this is a student that has been slowly losing their vision, and they have been working and working and working with them to use Braille and other non-visual accommodations, and the student refuses. And this is a student who, you know, if it had been started maybe from infant and toddler status to do Braille and more non-visual things, knowing that there was a degenerative condition, it might not be so foreign. I was doing the I Am Able training with Diane Wormsley this year, and I think one of the things that I really loved what she said is that Braille does not make you blind. There is nothing about learning Braille that should be so scary to parents, because it's not going to make you blind. So that's a nice little quote that I thought was kind of interesting. Also in the functional vision assessment, just looking at what do the eyes look like, giving that kind of information. Behavioral abnormalities, whether or not the child light gazes or presses their eye, and indicating details about that. Are they always pressing their right eye? Is it the left? Is it both eyes? So making sure you have that kind of information in detail. Looking at functional peripheral fields. And again, we want to look at those peripheral fields, those functional fields, good information for media, for reading, for how a student is gaining information. If fields are really constricted, gaining literacy media presented at a distance is going to be difficult. Where things are placed, how they are accessing things is going to be difficult. In a functional vision assessment, looking at color informally and formally. I've done assessments where I have presented different colors, single colors to students, and they have done a great job discriminating them. But when you present a picture, they have difficulty discriminating blue and greens that are next to each other and of a similar hue, and that's really good information. So you want to make sure you're doing formal and informal things with identification and matching. Looking at a child's sensitivity to light through observation and student questioning. Also, again, considering for literacy media and learning media, what is a student's near acuity and discrimination, and what are their distance acuity and discrimination? And using formal and functional measures or observation for this information is really, really critical. Again, I had a student this year who the teacher said, oh, they're reading 12-point font. And I thought, okay, that's great. And actually something I forgot to mention at the in the learning media section is, you know, they said they're doing 12-point font. And I said, okay. So I was assessing their fluency, and I gave them primer text. So you always want to use just something that's really easy for the student to read for the reading fluency. And when I gave them the text in 12-point font, they did okay. I mean, slower than usual. When I went up to 36, the students' fluency increased. And that was really significant to me, because here's a student who's getting 12-point font in class and being told that their fluency is really low. And while it still wasn't up to par with what should be for their age and grade level, it definitely increased a significant amount by increasing the font. Also, when you're looking at learning media and whether or not Braille is appropriate, we have to consider what is considered a functional size of print. So if you are doing a functional vision assessment and a student is using magnification and they can get 3 letters on the screen, that's not functional. So we want to be considering those kinds of things, which again is why doing a functional vision assessment and a learning media assessment together really provides comprehensive information. Another piece to consider is a student's depth perception. And you know, you can do this. Observations are great. Demonstration, looking at them traveling. Familiar areas are most easily accessed. If possible, trying to contrive something novel or unfamiliar is also very beneficial. Whether or not they are able to pick up objects and place them in a container, how accurate are they with doing that? You can see students do that, or ask them to help you with a task while you're there. Oh, hey, I'll do things, and I have clear plastic bags, and I'll say, oh, can you help me clean these up? And I'll have them pick up the little pieces and put them in the plastic bag. I'll give them different tasks and kind of contrive things that are natural within it to get those observations. Whether or not they can catch a ball, yes, this might be difficult, but looking at where they do they overreach, do they underreach, are they kind of accurate, but maybe they're just, you know, not able to do it because their discrimination, their acuity is a little bit off or off some. And then also looking at contrast sensitivity. And again, I have seen students, I have on this PowerPoint, the picture of the Hiding Heidi low contrast face test. And I've used a variety of different formal measures for contrast sensitivity. And I have found students that will discriminate down to next to the lowest contrast level. But then when I show them some different things or ask questions, they tell me that they actually prefer the higher contrast. And again, just because they can do lower contrast doesn't always mean that that's what's most appropriate. And along with contrast, you want to look at whether or not that color piece to it. Is black on white really most appropriate? Is it white on black? Is it maybe pink on green? I'm just throwing out different things. The blue background with the yellow. I know I personally prefer to look at things that have white text and a black background. It's a lot less painful and I don't get as bad of a headache. So probably should have made my presentation like that. So just to kind of review, the components that are shared with a learning media assessment and a functional vision assessment include a validity statement, purpose of the assessment, background, visual functioning, a record review, assessment strategies and tools, assessment results, interviews with parents or caregivers, teachers or service providers, and student interviews, a summary, and recommendations. A learning media assessment should include the use of sensory channels, which you can obtain through observation, reading efficiency, formal function and functional reading and writing skills, and literacy tools. And functional vision assessment components, again, student observations, what do the eyes look like, whether or not there is any eye pressing or light gazing, functional and peripheral fields, color discrimination, sensitivity to light, near acuity and discrimination, distance acuity and discrimination, depth perception, and contrast sensitivity. And again, keeping in mind that assessment is a process and that while there are components that should be included as best practice, since there is no standard piece, that we're looking at what tools do we have available to us and how can we gain that information. When I think about a learning media assessment and I think about formal and functional reading and writing skills, that is going to look different for me depending on the student and what information is available to me and which tools I choose to use based on that student. There are so many tools out there. And actually it's in my resources and I failed to mention it within here. The NRMA is a great tool. Like I said, there are some different things that are linked. In my resources, I have the FVA LMA kit from APH, the Learning Media Assessment book that I referenced by Koenig and Holbrook, Perkins Scout, Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, FVA LMA worksite, which is linked, earubric.com, the National Reading Media Assessment, NRMA, the All Children Can Read Literacy Skills Checklist. Along with that checklist, if you even just Google All Children Can Read, you will come up with that checklist. And when you click on that link, there is another link that says Steps to Literacy, which is also in the resources for anybody who's not with us on the PowerPoint and is just joining by phone. It's called Steps to Literacy, and you can print it out, but there are hyperlinks in there with ideas for different activities. I find this to be a really great tool, and sometimes I do get very detailed in my recommendations. Other times it's just a great resource to provide to teachers, parents, because there are things that you can be doing. And sometimes, again, depending on the student, for a younger student, a student with significant multiple disabilities, something as simple as making sure that people are consistent in developing a relationship with a child are really important, especially when you consider that classes change and staff change and things like that happen. So we want to make sure that we're really looking at these steps and these pieces and using tools and resources when we're providing recommendations, and not just kind of grasping at straws or coming up with things out of thin air. So a lot of these checklists and tools provide us with some great recommendations for those future needs. And again, also linked here are the indicators of readiness for a functional and a conventional literacy program. And then at the end of the PowerPoint, there are 2 slides worth of references with some hyperlinks that are also available. So I actually flew through that, worried about not getting through everything. I usually end up running out of time. So I guess at this point, does anyone have any questions?
And feel free to ask your questions. I can unmute you, or you can type them in the chat box if you're online. So you can also, I think, unmute yourself. So feel free to speak your questions.
Hi, this is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
I just had a question. Early in the presentation, you said something about their native language and finding out if they were born in the U.S. Some of that is a little, well, most of our students, it might be a little awkward to ask that. It's not always in their medical history. Mm-hmm. And where would that go, I guess, in the report is my basic question.
I would put that, I actually would put that under the background information for the students. I'm actually trying to flip through to find that. So again, that native language can be, you know, is it English? Is it Spanish? Even just like the use of Braille or the use of, you know, objects for some of our students who are not at that point of being able to do for communication, they're at that object level. But that kind of information, the native language, for me, would go in the background section.
And some of that is, I mean, some of our students with multiple disabilities, if they're nonverbal, they may be hearing a different language at home, but they're hearing English at school. And so, you know, they don't really, we don't know how much they're understanding, and there may not be a language.
And I think that that's where it becomes really important to include in the background information that at home X language is spoken and they receive all of their education in English. And again, doing as many educational assessments as I've done, I've actually had a few students who we weren't sure if it was the language or their actual ability to demonstrate. And while the family wanted the assessment completed in English, we actually had somebody who speaks Spanish come and administer a few of the test items in Spanish just to kind of get a sense for what's what. And we're able to kind of determine that it probably is more language than ability. So again, I do think that just even indicating, you know, student X, you know, has Spanish them at home all the time, but in school they're educated in English, and this could be, you know, an impact to their literacy, to their communication, and just indicating that as a consideration. You don't necessarily need to make that determination, but making sure that the reader of that report has that information is really critical.
Yeah. And I have a student who came to the States in like 9th grade, and she had never been to school, and from Africa, and found out a while later that her grandpa said she was not even fluent in their native language. So here I am trying to teach her Braille and along with English, and she didn't even know her native language very well. So that makes an impact.
It definitely does. And again, you may not have had that information when you wrote your report, but if you did, that would be critical information for the reader of your report to have as background knowledge on that student.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Kind of ran through that very quickly, so I wouldn't be offended if you had a question.
A lot of the things that we do in PG County are, a lot of what you said is the same that we do, but I did get a few tips of different things or different ways of doing it, so I appreciate it.
Well, you guys are lucky in PG County to have Lisa, and I won't lie, the course by Karen Blankenship really kind of mirrors that QPVI that Lisa was doing when she was the low vision incidence person for Maryland. So the information is really great. So I'm not surprised that you guys have that level of comprehensiveness happening there.
Yeah.
Very lucky. And I will say, for anybody who's looking at this and thinking, yeah, this is crazy, she's got a lot of stuff that she expects to be done, it is best practice. And we do realize that, I do realize that it's not always possible, which sometimes I find myself in time constraints, and I know that I'm not providing 100% of what I want to, but I make sure that I am doing what I consider to be absolutely the best and getting as much important information for that particular student. Again, it goes back to that individualized process and doing what I can do best for that student. It's not always ideal, but it's definitely about what is best for that student. And I think the two biggest pieces are what are the current needs and what are the future needs, and really using it as a process and looking at the tools that you can use and having a toolbox for yourself to give your student a toolbox.
Yeah, and this is Conchita. I just wanted to add one comment that keeps coming up. So we do, while yes, ideally, we really want an I-report, we do not have to have an I-report to make a student eligible for services. And I like how you highlighted, sometimes we used to in the past, and other places do incorrectly, say, a child has to meet a certain acuity, or a child has to meet a certain visual field. And that is not the case for eligibility in Maryland, or it should not be the case anywhere else in the country. It is, does it impact the child's educational needs? So ideally, we have an I-report. Ideally, we have the medical information that we need. But if we don't, we can still do an LMA and a functional, and does it impact the child's educational needs? And then, and then we can make them eligible. So I just want to highlight that because that's been brought up several times. So it is not necessary to have an I-report in order to do that. And that was an OSEP letter that came out not too long ago. So there's no acuity to say at this acuity a child becomes eligible, or you have to have an I-report. So just to clarify.
Thank you. I appreciate you highlighting that. And I think, Conchita, the other thing I really want to highlight from this is that we should always, always, always be providing instruction in Braille unless there is an assessment that says otherwise. We might get a kid who's, from infants and toddler level, who is very visual, and so therefore we're not emphasizing Braille. And unless there is an assessment that says Braille is not appropriate, that needs to be their primary medium, or at least they need to be receiving education and instruction in Braille until determined otherwise.
Yes, that's great.
One of the big things I think I learned myself when taking on this role and doing research, and it's really become a passion of mine. I love Braille, and it's I have a student who I had when he was 4, and he is now a junior in high school. And at the time, he had vision in one eye, was learning Braille, and has since lost his vision, and said to me, you know, you all told me I might lose my vision, but, you know, I just didn't want to listen to you. And still is not a fan of Braille, but does realize what we were all trying to do for him at the time. Definitely listening.
And I think the point you make about just because they can do it doesn't mean they should do it. Like just because a child can read 14-point font doesn't mean they should. There was a really good webinar, I'm not even going to say where it's from because I don't remember, on CVI not too long ago, that has since been shared, and that was one of the points they made, that, you know, their student could see the worksheet normally, but it wasn't what was best for the child. Because of eye fatigue and thinking about future needs, you know, that's not long term. And so thinking about just because a child can do it doesn't mean that's what is ideal for them in the long run.
Yeah, and along that line, Conchita, I think one of the comments I hear frequently is, that kid's acuity is so good. Well, again, that eye fatigue, there are lots of different factors that impact whether or not print is good. And in that toolbox, maybe print is good for reading a grocery list or doing a quick worksheet, but then to read a chapter or to do different longer term things, print is not the best medium.
Right, and sometimes saying, you know, a lot of our kids could be dual media. And there's a really good resource that I can add it to the video once I post it, about how to do instruction with dual media students, because I think we really struggle as TVIs. Okay, if this is a dual student who is, you know, can see print but would benefit from Braille, how can we best instruct them, and when should they be using print, when should they be using Braille? So I think those are all really good strategies for us to know, so that we're also not shying away from, you know, Braille really would be something that can help as Braille, as print. They can do both Braille and print.
Yep, I definitely agree with that.
Awesome. Does anyone have any more questions? Okay, well, Michelle, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm just really excited that we're going to be able to archive this on YouTube. Everyone, y'all will receive an email from me tomorrow with the link for YouTube, the PowerPoint that has all of the links, and a survey. Please take the survey. Let us know your thoughts. We would greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much, Michelle.
Great. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.